Americans across the country are expected to protest tomorrow against the Trump administration. It's another No Kings Day, and organizers predict it could become the largest mass protest in American history. This weekend's demonstration will be the third No Kings event, this time playing out against the backdrop of the U.S. war with Iran and growing anger over immigration enforcement. Events are planned in all 50 states, with the flagship march in St. Paul, Minnesota, drawing appearances from Bruce Springsteen, Joan Baez, and Jane Fonda. MS Now's Nnamdi Egwuonwu joins us with a preview of this weekend's events. Nnamdi, tell us more. What are organizers expecting tomorrow?
Well, they're expecting millions to turn out, Anna. You know, when you think about these No King Days protests, during the first set of these protests in June, they were in direct response to the administration's effort to reshape the federal government through mass layoffs, but also reshape cultural institutions like the one behind me, the Kennedy Center. Among the president's first actions in office was firing the bipartisan board of the Kennedy Center, installing himself as chair, and targeting programming he deemed woke. He took similar action at the Smithsonian. That fueled those protests we saw in June, when we saw 7 million Americans turn out to protest in October during the second set of protests. They were in response to the administration surging federal immigration agents and National Guardsmen to American cities, Chicago and Los Angeles being two of the cities at the forefront during that time. Now, organizers tell me the set of issues that are fueling this third round of protests has grown exponentially to include the war in Iran, which organizers are framing as an illegal war that has already cost the lives of at least a dozen American service members. They're also saying it comes amid the backdrop of what we saw in Minneapolis, when the surge of immigration agents there led to violence, led to the shootings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. We know that the national kickoff event, the flagship No Kings Day protest, is actually going to be taking place in St. Paul, Minnesota, partially because of what we saw take place in Minnesota earlier this year. So all of these things adding to the frustrations that organizers say they expect will lead to millions of Americans turning out to participate in this. Just some key stats we've gotten: over 3,200 events, including one in the Arctic Circle, more than 2,200 events in non-urban centers, which organizers say speaks to interest beyond cities. And here's a big notable one, Anna. Big numbers in red states, with more than 100 events in Texas, more than 120 events in Florida, and more than 110 events in Ohio. The event with the state with the most events, Anna, remains California, with more than 350.
Okay, Nnamdi Egwuonwu, thanks so much for giving us that preview. And joining us now is Julian Zelizer, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. He has a new article on his Substack, No Kings, No Bystanders: How Ordinary Americans Bend the Arc of History. Julian, the first No Kings protest took place just this past summer, and we saw millions turn out. But so much has happened since then. How do you expect tomorrow to be different from what we witnessed in June and October?
Well, it sounds like it's going to grow in scale and scope, and it keeps expanding in terms of where this is happening. It's not just on college campuses or in cities. It's really all over the country. And finally, this round comes on top of many other rounds where protest becomes more normal, where people are more comfortable coming out and expressing their opposition to what the administration is doing. So I do think tomorrow can be a big day of protest.
American opposition has not been silenced. It has not been quashed. The U.S. has a history of strong anti-war movements, in particular. I'm thinking around Vietnam. Can you talk about some of the similarities of those protests and what's happening now against the backdrop of this new U.S. military operation in Iran?
Sure. Social protest is as American as apple pie. It's part of the tradition of this country. During Vietnam, this was really important to gradually, it's a slow process, building opposition to what first President Lyndon Johnson and then President Richard Nixon were doing. And initially, the protests are seen as radical, they're seen as marginal, they're seen as centered on college campuses. But by 1969, when you have a moratorium day on Vietnam in October and November of 1969, there are protests taking place all over the country. And I think it just changes how people think. It changes what's the conventional wisdom about what's right and wrong.
It's one thing to shout your opposition. It's another for that to actually lead to change. Based on what we've seen throughout American history, how do grassroots movements like these lead to real change?
Well, you can think of the civil rights movement. It took many years before grassroots protesters in the Deep South and in the North were able to get not just the ear of politicians, but get politicians who would actually do something. And it's simply persistence and determination. And the protests have to continue. People have to keep expressing it. And the thing is, politicians listen. And in 1964 and 65, you had a president who responded, Lyndon Johnson, with Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act. So it's not a one-day process. And I think that's really the essence of how protests work. It can take months, if not years, but it's important, and that's what moves history.
I mean, we've talked about civil rights now. We've talked about Vietnam, and those protests were so instrumental in our country's history. They were turning points in some ways. Past attendance, though, from these protests, the No Kings protests, are already in the top 5 of mass protests in U.S. history. What does that say about where we are right now as a country?
Well, I think there's just a lot of opposition to what's happening from Washington. There was some conventional wisdom after the 2024 election that Trumpism had won the hearts and minds of America. But I think the size of the protests you're seeing is just not true. And there is a large portion of this country that is not happy with the direction of the country, whether it's overseas or whether it's in cities like Minneapolis, and they are expressing their frustration. And I think politicians on Capitol Hill would do well to listen and watch what's going on all around the country.